Hello, this is Al, and I am here with some friends, and we're talking about Maggie Estep's piece, Hey Baby. We've got two versions of it. One is a MTV promo video, which is a short version of it, and it's a little talkier and less band-backed and songy than the other version we have, which is a video of Hey Baby as it was released by Rock Video Monthly in 1994. And we have here on the phone, we have Anna Strong. Hello, Anna. How are you?
Hey, Al.
And we have Amaris Cuchanski. Hi, Amaris.
Hi, Al.
And we are really, really happy and feel privileged to have on the phone Cristin O'Keefe Aptowicz, who I'm going to introduce very briefly, but basically Kristen is and has been a slam poet and also is someone who's published about the literary history of slam. So let me just say that Kristen, we know Kristen particularly because in 2010-11, you were the Arts Edge Artist in Residence here at the Kelly Writers House of the University of Pennsylvania, right, Kristen? That was fun.
Yes, I was, absolutely.
And you joined the New York City slam poetry community in the late 90s. You founded or co-founded or continued the NYC Urbana Poetry Slam series, which Bob Holman had been somewhat involved in. Am I right about that?
Yes, I was a sophomore at NYU. I was 19 years old when I first became a part of the New York City Poetry Slam movement and went to the National Poetry Slam for the first time. And that fall, I started a series called NYC Urbana, which would go on to win 3 National Poetry Slam championships. And it was a continuation of Bob Holman's Mouth Almighty Poetry Slam. And Mouth Almighty was a spoken word label on Mercury Records, which put out Maggie Estep's album.
Yeah,
No More
good.
Mr. Nice Girl. And love it
No More Mr. Nice Girl. Yeah, I mean, that was, I remember listening to that when it first came out. In 2010, you represented NYC Urbana at the Women of the World Poetry Slam, and you have 6 books of poetry, including most recently The Year of No Mistakes, and you've been in a slam concert film and the documentary film Slam Planet, and the reason why I really got excited about your joining us is that in 2008 you published through Soft Skull Press a book called Words in Your Face, a guided tour through 20 years of the New York City Poetry Slam. So thank you so much for talking with us. And the three of us probably will just have a bunch of questions for you about this piece. But why don't we just start by saying, asking you to say, Kristen, something about Maggie Estep's piece. This particular piece, was it aligned with the tone and the mode of a lot of other pieces she was doing at the time? Is it a fairly typical piece for her?
Absolutely, and definitely an emblematic piece of the Poetry Slam movement in that time period. The Poetry Slam movement was born in Chicago in the mid-1980s, created by a Chicago construction worker named Mark Smith, and it came to New York City in the late 1980s through the largesse of Bob Holman, who we spoke about earlier. Bob Holman has had a long history in the New York City poetry world, and he started the Nuyorican Poets Cafe's Poetry Slam, which is held every Wednesday and every Friday. And one of the earliest known poets associated with the Poetry Slam, both nationally and in New York City, was Maggie Estep. And at that time period, the sort of popular theme and approach was sort of, I would guess you would call a rant, a person who spoke from a first-person perspective about their lives, sort of speaking out against injustice in either a very aggressive way, either comedically or non-comedically. And in Maggie's case, it was a very sort of edgy comedy. And Maggie spoke from a very feminist perspective and a very aggressively female perspective. And so this piece, Hey Baby, was one of her most popular pieces and became very emblematic of the Poetry Slam movement because of MTV. MTV began to take an interest in the spoken word movement around the same time that Lollapalooza did. And between MTV and Lollapalooza, poetry was introduced to the youth of America in a way that they had not seen since the Beat era, when poetry seemed very accessible and cool and something young people did. instead of sort of academic and out of reach of young people. And Maggie's piece in particular was extremely popular. Hey Baby was not only used as an interstitial, which meant it was cut down to about a 45-second or so length and put it in between commercials, but it was actually played as a music video in the music video section, and in fact famously was on Beavis and Butthead, the cartoon show of MTV, where Maggie was particularly excited that they seemed to really like it.
That's totally crazy.
They couldn't believe, they were like, who's this hot chick? They couldn't stop that, so it's really great.
There was a moment where slam poetry was on television through MTV. Did the practitioners, being fairly radical people, did they feel commodified? Were they okay with that? And I've had this conversation with Edwin Torres, who, by the way, whose one of his poems we encounter in Mod Po as well. And Edwin Torres is in this video, but we can talk about that more later. What was the reaction? Everybody seemed to like the 15 minutes on MTV. I'm saying 15 minutes, but it was more like a year or two.
Well, I think that you have to remember that, the Poetry Slam is a national movement, and for those of you who've never heard of Poetry Slam, it's a competition where a poet gets up and performs their own work in usually 3 minutes or less with no props, costumes, or musical accompaniment, and it has to be their own work. So Poetry Slams, anything could be a poem. You could do a limerick, you could do a haiku, you could do something rhyming or not rhyming. Essentially, whatever your community wants to reward, that is what a slam poem is. And the popularity of these MTV interstitials and eventually MTV's Unplugged series, which is sort of acoustic music, did a spoken word Unplugged. And then later, PBS hired Bob Holman to curate a United States Poetry series.
Right.
It began to push forward a certain vision of what spoken word, and especially what was considered slam poetry, should be like. And in this case, it was young, urban, edgy, oftentimes comedic, but definitely sort of in your face and aggressive. And the people in the Poetry Slam, while excited that some of their poets were being thrust into the spotlight and certainly wanted to have success, really worried that it was narrowing the vision of what Poetry Slam could be, and that people would come to Poetry Slam with expectations of what it should be like. And this is actually a common complaint that existed throughout the Poetry Slam movement, which is now, 30 years old. You have projects that suddenly make the Poetry Slam seem like it should be something, and people worry about it throwing the entire movement off course. But nothing ever kills Poetry Slam. It constantly reinvents itself. And in fact, Maggie Estep, who was so popular in the early 90s version of Poetry Slam, came back and performed, I believe, this poem on HBO's Deaf Poetry program, which was one of the most popular Poetry Slam television shows of all time, and sort of helped thrust Poetry Slam forward in the early aughts.
So thank you. This is so this poem we picked a good one. It's a kind of an anthemic poem. So what I want to do, Anna and Amaris, is just we'll look at this particular piece a little bit, and then we'll invite Kristen to sort of add to our reading of it. So Anna, do you want to say in the most general piece is about what's happening? I mean, it should be fairly straightforward.
We have a female speaker who's walking down the street and getting harassed, I guess, by a guy.
A guy, yep. And is that it? How does she respond to him? At first, how does she respond?
At first, she's. I feel like she kind of she brushes him off a little bit, and then he goes further and further and says the weirdest thing about taking a bath in non-dairy creamer. And
she says that to him. Yeah. What does he say to her first?
You got something against men part is at the end, right?
No, that's at the end. Yeah. Hey, miss, don't miss this. So it's a stupid pun on miss.
Yeah. Then he
All right, Amaris, how would you describe her response to this guy who's harassing her?
Well, she initially tries the sincere approach, I guess, making it known that she's uncomfortable with his sort of leering at her. But then she turns it around and becomes kind of provocative and ironic because he doesn't understand how his behavior is so inappropriate. And it's this classic situation of, unfortunately, a very common situation of a woman getting harassed on the street and the guy turning it back and saying, "What's wrong with you, baby?"
Right,
and
exactly.
she's kind of trying to expose the silliness of that. To put it really lightly, calling him stupid is putting it really lightly for her.
So what she suggests that they do is so outrageous. I wouldn't say it's vaguely sexual. It's very sexual, but it's oddly sexual. It's about, she's got a bunch of non-dairy creamer on her hands and some time to kill. Let's make gallons of artificial milk till our bladders are painfully full. We're going to sit on the toilet together and let the water run in the shower and torture ourselves by not letting ourselves urinate as the water rushes loudly in the bathtub. Okay? Now, I'm sorry to put this so bluntly, but what's going on? What kind of rhetorical move is that? I'm going to ask Anna and Amaris, and then I can't wait to hear what Kristen has to say about that. But where does this come from in the world of writing, in the world of poetry? I mean, what is this?
It's pretty vulgar, pretty. Anna, you want to take it?
Anna, it's vulgar.
You punting?
What else?
Well, I think the ludicrousness of it kind of throws into sharp relief, like how ludicrous it is that men can approach women in this way, like in the street, and accost them with like what. I mean, I don't even want to like get into like personal stuff that's been said to me when I've been walking down the street, or like things I've heard of friends that's happened to them. I mean, but I guess like for her to respond to his advances with such a ludicrous sexual situation.
Sexual, yeah. Sexual is probably better than ludicrous. Can you say, before we turn to Kristen, say one more thing about what exactly? I mean, she's being aggressive and basically inviting him sexually, but to do something that's so full of irony. You know, milk with all of its sexuality. Well, this is artificial milk, and they're going to drink it, and then they're going to go in the shower and not let themselves urinate. They're going to be bloated. It's a very strange. Ultimately not a very sexy kind of thing. And what's his response to you? I mean, you from the video we get to see him act it out, but what do you imagine his response to be, Anna or Amaris?
I mean, exactly. He turns it back on her. Something's automatically wrong with her because she's exposed how intrusive and threatening he's being to her.
By what? Being intrusive and threatening to him?
No. She immediately calls him out she feels threatened. She says, "I'm feeling pretty tense, buddy."
Yeah, but then she does this thing, has this crazy idea. "We'll do it together," she says, "okay? And I'll spring for some of that blue stuff for the toilet bowl. All right?"
And
Kristen,
then he
what
says,
do you think?
"You got something
go ahead.
against
I'm sorry,
men." And then he says, "You got something against men."
And she says, "No," I said, "I don't have anything against men.
Just stupid men."
Stupid men, yeah. So it's very comic, but I'm very interested, Kristen, in your sense of what move, I mean rhetorically, verbally, what is she doing there when she goes on this rant about an encounter with artificial milk and all? What do you think?
Well, I mean, it's clear hyperbole that she is, at first she tries to shut the situation down, and then when it doesn't, she lets the pendulum swing so far in the opposite direction that it is obviously hugely loved by audiences. I mean, this is like a crowd-pleasing piece. They eat it up and just howl and scream because I think, again, women are put in these situations, and frequently you're just supposed to either ignore them or just sort of smile and just try to get through the situation, and to respond not just in anger, but in such a comedic way to say, that kind of highlights women's agency too. It's kind of saying, hey, maybe I am this person. You don't know who you're yelling at on a street. You're assuming that all women are docile and, that you would be the dominant one sexually, but, you just don't know who I am, and maybe I'm the kind of person who likes this freaky stuff. And to me,
freaky stuff. So, I mean, there's a bit of a sadistic quality to the hyperbolic sexual encounter that, she's going to scare him because she's actually quite powerful, and he's not really going to want to do this. presumably.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think, like, this is sexuality and consent were just huge issues back in, there's still issues today, but in the early 90s, that was the first time that consent was really being put onto a national dialogue of, like, needing to hear yes and needing to move forward. And I think that this piece matched with also a very popular piece at the same time period, which is John S. Hall's Detachable Penis, which was also a huge hit, a spoken word piece about a man who had a detachable penis and how it was good for him because he could separate himself from his sexuality and get out of trouble sometimes, but bad for him because sometimes he would lose it and need to buy it from street vendors when he finds it on on flea market tables. Those two, I think, are great parallel pieces of that sort of, in Maggie's case, this period is, this piece is putting Maggie out as sort of very aggressive, self-aware, sexually empowered, and not going to be submissive to whatever comes her way. She's going to be dominant in a time period when that was being challenged nationally in dialogue. And the same way John S. Hall, who, by the way, appears in the video for Hey Baby. He is the guy harassing on the street. He's talking about a way of, like, hey, men, don't be led by your sexuality. Imagine if you didn't have to, always lead with your dick, so to speak, all the time, and sort of playing with the idea of, hey, maybe that's true. Like, maybe we need to have a dialogue about how we're not just led by our testosterone, but we have the capacity to make decisions that aren't just based in aggressive, dominant sexuality. And so it's interesting to look at those pieces as a pair, and really great that they appear in this video together.
Yeah, it really is. And so now, John C. Hall, he in the Detachable Penis, it's ambiguous as to where the artist stands. Am I right, in relation to the detachable penis?
Yeah,
in other words, his sexual
like,
position is not entirely clear.
It's sort of a surreal concept that is never explained, and he just sort of talks about life with a detachable penis with sort of a blasé sort of, this is what happens with a detachable penis, and that was a gigantic hit. It was Maggie and John S. Hall were the two probably best known poets to come out of this New York spoken word movement. And it's interesting to note that John S. Hall has never been in a poetry slam. And so while Maggie came from the poetry slam movement, John S. Hall came parallel to it from the same community but was not involved. And yet they both had sort of meteoric success into mainstream that would not be seen again for some time.
And what's interesting is that John F. Hall's decision to appear as the annoying, victimizing, sexist jerk in this piece kind of, as you suggested, declares where he stands.
Yeah.
So the two pieces work really well together. All right, so I want to ask Anna and Amaris about a line that happens that comes in the beginning of this piece. And I hope I'm quoting it right. I'm going to say what the line is and then ask you guys to somehow respond to why it's there. She says at the very beginning, when she's looking at us in the video, I got a freaking song in my heart, so let's go. I got a freaking song in my heart. What do you think she means by that, Anna or Amaris? I don't have an interesting way to start the piece.
Yeah.
It is. I think she's certainly getting at the... Sorry, Amaris, go ahead.
I was wondering if she's trying to turn around typical pop songs. Like, the title immediately made me think of, this is probably wrong, but Hey Baby from, like, Dirty Dancing, songs like that, where the man is singing, he's, the woman is like the sexual object of his attention.
It's very positive and romantic.
Yes, it's romantic. It's like this nice poppy, supposed to be like complimentary. It's the same exact setting. He's observing a woman on the street and asking her to be his girl. And so I was wondering, since it says, I have got a fucking song in my heart, right after she says she's feeling pretty tense, it seems like she's responding to how she knows she's in the social world she's supposed to act, quote unquote. Yeah. But immediately she turns that around pretty aggressively.
Yes, and so I've got a song in my heart is a traditional positive romantic line that a woman would say in response to being loved. So she adds freaking or fucking. I think it's freaking, actually. I got a freaking song in my heart, and the intrusion of freaking already de-romanticizes it, like instantly.
And that's when she turns around. That's when she says, come on, let's go. So she's exactly what Kristen was saying, like taking agency, putting her voice in the situation, saying, what if, I'm telling you what I want us to do? How does that change the situation then?
But I also see that, I really like that line. I also see that line in a way addressing us, as if to say, I've got something I want to say. It's like a prologue, right?
Yeah.
So I've got something I want to say, and this is my piece, this is my poem, this is my art. And so let's go is almost like, all right, I'm going to get this off my chest right now. I've got something to say. Yeah, Anna, what do you think?
I'm kind of going a little bit more with your reading, Al. I mean, Amaris, as always, is giving the amazing, second level, holy crap response. But for me, I feel like that is an invitation to the reader, or the listener, I suppose, in this case. Like, for me, it's like, here I am, I'm a poet, I got something I'm going to say to you, so let's go, It's an invitation, and it's a way of launching in, like, my turn.
Yeah. Okay. So, Kristen, you and I know that Edwin Torres makes a cameo appearance here in this piece. I wonder, Anna and Amaris, you've heard Edwin Torres, but I don't know if you've ever seen him. So this is kind of an unfair question, but he's in it. Did you notice Edwin Torres in the video?
No, I did not know that. No.
Okay. Kristen, where is Edwin Torres? He's participating in this, right?
Yes, he is. So there's, the main male harasser in the video, played by poet John S. Hall, and then there's men who are swinging on sort of meat hooks, as being pieces of meat, and among them is John S. Hall. So he's one of the men in the Edwin Torres. Edwin Torres.
Yeah, he's hanging at the far left, and I think, and they stamp qualities of meat on their foreheads, and I think he gets a prime or something like that, which is kind of, I see that as kind of solidarity, right, on the part of the guys in the movement.
Absolutely. I think that she was a tremendous leader and someone who was not to be messed with, and members of all genders really responded well to Maggie, and so they all came out in support, and they would all support each other. I mean, while it's revisionist history to see them as sort of established poets, back then they were all just kids trying stuff out. So why wouldn't you be in each other's music videos?
Exactly.
And I mean, they stayed friends throughout their life. When Maggie passed away this past February at the early age of 50, John S. Hall traveled out and spoke at her memorial in Hudson. I mean, they were still close friends all the way until the end of her life.
Yeah. So we in ModPo, which is a really fast 10-week look at lots and lots of poetry from the 1860s to the present. We put this piece, along with one piece by Edwin Torres and a performance piece by Jane Cortez, in the chapter on the beats. Mm-hmm. And that's a stretch. It's kind of a big category. But I wonder if, Kristen, you would spend a minute just talking us through what kind of possible connections from the beat intrusion, the beat intervention, the beat revolution to slam poetry, to spoken word poetry. Is there a lineage? Is there a connection?
Absolutely, especially the slam poetry world that Maggie sprung from. It was very much influenced by New York City, and New York City has had an incredible live literature movement, as we sort of call it now, live lit. And it began, the roots of poetry slam, I believe, can be traced back to the Harlem Renaissance, when poets began speaking about themselves and their circumstances in a way that was very confrontational to the dialogue that was written about them by the press. And then you moved into the Beats, who, again, were very counterculture and speaking about things that were not supposed to be spoken about and gearing their audiences towards younger people who they believe were change makers. And then you move into the Black Arts movement of the 70s, and then hip-hop hip-hop, obviously, in the 1980s, and they all sort of blend together in New York. You have all of this history of first-person narratives being spoken in real time to an audience of people who don't view those people as, quote, others. And so, the Poetry Slam movement was birthed from all of these disparate live literature elements, and it actually brought together a very diverse group of poets and writers. And Maggie definitely was a trailblazer in the same way that you have sort of poets who are emblematic of the Beat era, your Kerouacs and your Barrows and your Allen Ginsbergs. Maggie was definitely a keystone in how people would view spoken word and especially poetry from the Poetry Slam movement from that point on. She was a touchstone, and a lot of people saw her on TV and said, that is what I want to do. I'm going to move to New York City and be a poet, and would just flock to the New York Poets Cafe. And to this day, the New York Poets Cafe, Friday Night Slam, is always standing room only, always a line at the door, and that began with Maggie Estep and Bob Holman.
And you said earlier in that comment that audiences did not see the performer as other. In other words, they felt that the performer was one of them. It was a communal thing. Is that what you meant?
Absolutely. I think that especially when contemporary society, and this is 20th century's vision of poetry. I think that poetry was something that in previous centuries was a working class art form, and people memorized poetry and read it to each other, and they would put poetry in the newspaper alongside sports scores. And it was only in the 20th century when you had this sort of cleaving where sort of you were academic and they had canon poets, and if you didn't understand the poetry that was being created, then you didn't understand poetry. There's something wrong with you. But with the Beat Poetry movement and Black Arts movement and the Poetry Slam movement, you had poetry that was being created for the same community, that was being performed to. And if outsiders didn't get it, if an outsider says, hey, this Poetry Slam's not poetry, that was their fault. Academia could reject Poetry Slam and the Beats all they wanted, but the communities that rose up and the artists that rose up out of those movements were completely legitimate and had audiences that were non-traditional to what academic poetry was seeing. And Maggie was a part of that. I mean, she got a major, record recording label to put out 2 albums of hers. She got major publishing houses to put out books of poetry, and eventually she became a novelist. I mean, she was a major figure, and that sprung out of this movement that was, so specialized in those early days, just in the New Eurekan Poets Cafe, which, back when she started was an unair-conditioned, unheated, roofless place in the Lower East Side, and only now is it, at the sort of storied arts organization. But back then, it was just making a comeback after it had been shuttered once the crack epidemic hit the Lower East Side. And she was one of those artists that gained so much attention and brought so many people to the New Eurekan Poets Cafe that she helped move that movement forward tremendously. So the entire Poetry Slam movement and the entire spoken word movement owes so much to Maggie Estep. And, we miss her like crazy. A lot of memorials and in memoriams poured out in the wake of her death. And it just speaks to how much she touched people and inspired people, and that goes to this day.
So thank you. So what I want to do is ask Anna and Amaris to make one quick observation about what you see in this work that runs from the Beats. What one quality do you see continuous in this poetry? So Amaris, what do you see that's continuous from the Beats?
Yeah, I definitely see exactly what Kristen was just talking about, sort of that bringing poetry back to the masses, the anti-academia, sort of changing the cadence of poetry, putting the emphasis on oral and spoken poetry versus poetry on the page. Sort of Ginsberg had this idea of the long breath poetry, and that's what Maggie Estep poem, actually, or the ABAB felt like to me, is this sort of rant in one breath that ends on this sort of cool note.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's what I saw in it.
That's great. Anna, what do you see from the Beats forward here to this?
I think just the immediacy and the nowness of it. I'm thinking maybe specifically of a poem like Howl that's dealing with what's happening to our generation, what's happening to me and my counterculture friends right now, what I'm seeing, these forces that are like acting around me that I don't like. I think Hey Baby has a lot to do with talking about things that are happening now and bringing poetry into that conversation.
And I guess I would add, on a level of language, that the strategy she uses in this piece, Hey Baby, to turn the tables around is something you would see especially in Ginsberg and somewhat in Kerouac's prose, where you get the hyperbolic tactic of outdoing someone else, such as a poem like America for Ginsberg or parts of Howl, and the surrealist tomfoolery, I would say, going to the edge and letting the words essentially create a rhetorical strategy of implying, well, if you think I'm crazy, guess what? I'm going to show you what crazy is. and she pulls it off linguistically. All right, so thank you all. Why don't we just go around for each of us and just say one final word, one final thing that you would want to be in a recorded conversation about this piece by Maggie Estep. So we'll start with Kristen. What final word do you have? Some one thing that we should know that we haven't said.
I think that there is a self-consciousness that of the poem that is really delightful. There's sort of a phrase among the kids these days, which is JK but FR, so in sort of texting slang that means just kidding but for real. And it means that you say something, you say something as a joke, but actually what you're getting at is a real issue. And so it really enables you to say things that are meaningful in a way that's lighthearted, but really also say that just because I'm bringing this up lightheartedly doesn't mean that it actually isn't an issue. And I think that this poem by Maggie Estep is very much in the vein of JK but FR, where, when she says that, there's a song in my heart, freaking song in my heart, so come on, let's go. I think it's kind of saying to the audience, hey, we've all been here before, and I'm going to take this to the level, an absurd level, but don't make a mistake here and think that the fear that I'm feeling in the first half of this poem isn't real, that tension and that not wanting to be bothered. Just because I'm able to handle this very well in this extreme way and a confident way doesn't mean that this should exist in the first place. She's not saying, hey, here's this great way to constantly deal with this street harassment. She's like, I wish street harassment didn't exist at all. And so to me, I think there's a self-consciousness of that is a through line through all of her work. I think she's very conscious of the idea that she is representing a certain slice of New York City and a certain attitude and a certain type of woman, but she doesn't do that to say, hey, I'm a type of woman, I have to put up with these problems. She says it to say, look at these problems. They shouldn't exist, and I'm the kind of woman who's going to point that out. And I think that is why people loved her.
Yeah, that's a political strategy for sure. Thank you so much. Anna, final word?
I really like that she's set this to music and written to music and filmed a music video, but the music is, I think, quite appropriate to what she's saying, the kind of aggressiveness, the in-your-faceness that she's addressing the audience about, exactly what Kristen just said, these problems that shouldn't exist. And she sets it to music that isn't like sonorous and cute and catchy. It very much echoes the content of her piece, which I really appreciate.
That's nice. Amaris, final word?
Yeah, I think one important difference between the Beats and the contemporary spoken word poetry movement is that the Beats was very much a boys' club. And I know that what drew me to the spoken word scene was that I saw a lot of women and a lot of minority poets performing, and I found that it was a really powerful platform when they were able to make the personal political and be aggressive and comic at the same time. There are just so many different sort of energies in play in these performances, and I think the Maggie Estep piece really embodies and epitomizes all that.
That's great. Well, thank you, Anna Strong, Amaris Cuchanski. Thank you both so much for hanging around and talking about this work. Thank you, guys.
Thank
you. Cristin Aptowicz, it's Aptowicz. And the book I referred to before is published by Soft Skull Press. I'm sure you can find it online. It's called Words in Your Face, a guided tour through 20 years of the New York City Poetry Slam. Kristen, thank you so much for spending time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.